welcome to the Week 9 DFS edition of the Fantasy Football Brothers podcast. My name is Blake. I'm joined with my younger brother Carson, and let's get it right into it. Last week, we talked about some of the players to look for, and some of them paid off, some of them didn't. This week, we're looking to improve, so let's start with quarterback.
Yeah, and I'll mention some really cheap guys at the end if you're really wanting to go cheap at this position. But as people that you feel like have a more safer floor and hopefully can, boom for you, because that's really what you need in DFS. You need all your players to boom, honestly. So setting yourself up the best you can.
For example, Emmanuel Sanders, who we talked about last week, did the opposite of a boom. He busted.
Yes, that was bad. Sorry, but we'll probably talk about him later. But for quarterbacks, I'll actually let you talk about him more because you have him in your lineup as of right now. But Derek Carr at 5,900. Walk us through that thought process, I guess.
Well, now Derek Carr, he's really had nothing sexy to his name this season besides it's basically the yardage amounts.
Yeah.
He's got over 300 yards in 5 of 7 games, and that's a 3-point bonus like we talked about last week. If you get over 300 yards passing, you get added 3 points to your total. So his DraftKings value is always a little bit above 20 points, 22, 23 points. So I like his floor. I think that between the Giants and the Raiders, it should be a competitive game. So I think there's the opportunity for passing in that game. So I like Derek Carr from that perspective, and at 5,900 there are certainly worse options at around that price.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because a lot of players at that price point, you're hoping they throw like enough touchdowns, but with Carr, he just throws all the yards, and then him getting more than 2 passing touchdowns is just an added bonus. So I think he's a good play as well.
Yeah, and he's proven himself good for at least 2 touchdowns in all but 1 game.
Yes.
So, yeah, I like him.
We'll move on. Talk about Kirk Cousins, 6,200. If you watched our matchup preview, we already did a little bit of analysis against the Baltimore defense. Baltimore allows the most passing yards against. And like we've said before, and we'll talk about it more as we talk about other skill position players, but stacking players as far as getting a quarterback and getting some of their receivers is a good strategy in daily. And, Thielen and Jefferson are both extremely fantasy relevant receivers, so I think that I like what Cousins could give you as far as versatility. I guess I can move on to the next one unless you have anything to add specifically about him.
Well, just the thought that we saw him struggle against the Cowboys last week, and I think that he's been pretty reliable leading up to that game. So I think he bounces back, and especially in a good matchup with the Ravens.
Yeah, I agree. The next quarterback we'll talk about is Dak Prescott at 6,900. First game back since week 7, I guess, or week 6, because he was on bye week 7 and out week 8. But 6,900 is not a very expensive price for Dak Prescott. He's eclipsed 7,000 before this season with his pricing, and he's facing the Denver Broncos defense, which unfortunately scares you even less with the absence of Von Miller as he was traded to the Rams. And again, I think he's a quarterback you can very easily stack with, and he's currently the quarterback I have in my lineup. So I just like his floor a lot, and I think Dak Prescott has a tremendously high ceiling. So I think he's a good daily pick.
Yeah, I agree with that. We've already seen him go over 400 yards twice this season. And under over 300 one additional time. But yeah, Dak Prescott's extremely talented. Occasionally, we haven't seen it a lot this season, but he does get involved with his legs some. And then, yeah, his pass catchers in terms of stacking opportunities are really good. We see that Amari Cooper is 5,700 for his salary, and that's extremely low considering his ceiling. Yeah. So that I think that's going to be a popular stack this week.
Yes, and then the final main quarterback I guess we'll talk about is the most expensive quarterback in daily this week. Josh Allen at 8,200. It's all because you're paying for a QB1 in a tremendously good matchup against the Jaguars. And again, you could pay high on Diggs Or you got options like Emmanuel Sanders and Cole Beasley. So you're paying the most for the quarterback that you can, but you're most likely paying for the QB1 of the week or someone close to it. So if you're wanting to spend a lot of money here, he is priced the most, but I think he's still an extremely safe pick, and that's why he costs so much. And I guess just to wrap up, I'll do the two quick picks that I mentioned earlier if you want to go really cheap at quarterback. So Jordan Love at 4,400 and Tyrod Taylor at 5,000. Jordan Love is so cheap because this really wasn't accommodating for Rodgers to be out, and he's in a decent matchup against Kansas City, who have allowed just have been overall a really poor defense this season. And Tyrod Taylor, it is in his first game back since week 2, where he started the season pretty strong, and he's facing a Dolphins defense that does not scare you at all, as they have allowed the second most passing yards against a game and second most total yards against per game. So those are the two options we say are extreme value picks at this position.
Yeah, I expect, especially in that Houston-Miami matchup, I expect it to be high scoring, similar to Thursday night's game this week, because it's two not great defenses and two offenses that are capable of putting up points. So I think it's a good matchup for DFS because there's going to be a lot of points scored. That's my prediction on that game.
Yeah, agreed. And I guess we'll move on to running backs, and I'll start you with someone you have in your lineup right now, Myles Gaskin at 5,800.
Yeah, so Myles Gaskin, and we've talked about him in our regular season show too, but we're looking at his game log here. Last week, 8.5 points. The week before that, 17.7. Week 6, 3.4 points. Week 5, 31.9. So based on that A-B type pattern, he's due for one. I mean, in addition to that, some real analysis. Houston's rush defense is second worst in the league. They're allowing just under 150 rushing yards per game. Myles Gaskin technically is a running back, and he can also catch the ball. So I think there's an opportunity here. I mean, he's got, looks like 24 targets in the passing game in the last 4 games. Wow. So that's 6 targets a game he's averaging in that stretch. I mean, that's a good amount, and then at the same time he's getting 10 to 15 rushes in those past 2 games. So yeah, I think that he could definitely burn you, but given the matchup and them being down Devontae Parker, there's an opening for Myles Gaskin to deliver on that pattern and have a boom game this week.
Yeah, I agree. Next running back we'll talk about someone who's only $100 more. Devontae Booker at 5,900. Saquon Barkley has been ruled out in this game, and I personally like Booker a lot because the Raiders' defense is much easier to rush against than pass against. They're ranked 28th, so they're really bad in allowing the most rushing yards per game, 131.3. And just in the games that Booker has filled in for Saquon, I guess the last 4 games, he's had double digits every single week, has even hit 20 points once. So I feel like, I mean, you're wanting to go for players that can boom for DFS, as we've already talked about. But a lot of players at this price range, they're boom or bust. And I think Booker has a good floor, a very reliable floor in Saquon's absence. And he also has the ability to boom and get you high teens or 20 points or so at a relatively cheap price. So that's why I've been looking at him as a potential option for DFS this week.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and I guess the next running back we can briefly talk about is Damien Harris at 6,000. Not an incredible matchup against the Panthers, although they are easier to run against than pass against, so that's good for Harris. The only thing that makes me nervous about Harris is that he just doesn't get much work in the passing game, but his floor is insanely good of the amount of rushing yards he gets each game, and he's on a streak of 4 straight games with a rushing touchdown, and that's what will allow him to boom. So I think you can trust that, and that's why I like him a lot this week. And yeah, I'll give you your next guy, Josh Jacobs at 6,200.
Yeah, so with Josh Jacobs being healthy, expecting him to play a full game, the Giants are just a good matchup for running backs, allowing 123 rushing yards per game. And then the other part of it is that he is on a touchdown streak of his own. He's got 3 touchdowns in his last 3 games. And I mean, besides that, I like the matchup. And obviously, we talked about Derek Carr. So, in those moments when, maybe Derek Carr gets down the field towards the red zone and he's already thrown 2 touchdowns, so he can't throw anymore. So, he has to give it to Josh Jacobs. And then he finds his way into the end zone. So, maybe that's how it goes down.
Yeah, I like that too. As far as now we're getting more of in the tier of players that you're spending a lot for at this position. Um, I'm really only going to mention one guy in depth here, just because I feel like there are a lot of good value picks that would be worth getting over these like well proven RB1 type guys. But Ezekiel Elliott at 7,000, I think is a good choice against the Broncos, as we've already mentioned before of Dak. Not an incredibly strong defense that is weaker without Von Miller. And last week against the Vikings, Zeke didn't do amazing, didn't do awful. Had 11.3 fantasy points, but I expect him to bounce back even more. And I just think that this is going to be a pretty dominant game for the Cowboys at home. And I mean, they're still 6 players more expensive than Zeke in DFS this week, so I think that he's still a good choice. Do we have anything else at running back that we want to highlight specifically?
I'll quickly mention Christian McCaffrey at $8,000. Now, if Christian McCaffrey, his peak of the season so far came back in week 2, where he was priced at $9,900. That's nearly a fifth of your entire salary for one player. Obviously, we know the talent of Christian McCaffrey, and we do know that going into this game, he is expected to be on a pitch count of sorts. He'll be getting a reduced number of snaps than he normally would, just because they don't want to, re-aggravate that injury. But the reality is that at $8,000, we know what Christian McCaffrey can do, and even with limited snaps, it's a pretty good matchup against my Patriots. So I would not be surprised if McCaffrey finds his way into the end zone a few times in that reduced role that he's going to be having.
Agreed. I guess we're ready to move on to the wide receivers, and I will start with Hunter Renfrow at 4,800. We've already talked about the Ruggs situation. I don't want to pull too much from that. Regardless of that situation, Renfrow probably will get even more targets, but he's been just very reliable as a fantasy player this entire season, and for some reason he's never been more than $5,000 in DFS, and this week he's 4,800 as already said. So
yeah, 4,900 is his season high.
Yeah, I just don't know. He's just not a flashy name. We've talked about him before in the past, just being like that, but he gets heavily targeted. He's very reliable. Only 2 receiving touchdowns this season, so that's not a ton, but you're getting someone that has an incredible floor just based off of catches and receiving yards, and then if he finds the end zone, that's a boom, and you're only paying 4,800 for him, so I like him a lot at that price. Let's see. The next one. I guess I'll let you talk about Christian Kirk a little bit at 5,300.
Yeah, so here's the thing with Kirk. We already know that A.J. Green is going to be missing this game, and DeAndre Hopkins is a game-time decision. Now, obviously, Kyler Murray is also a game-time decision. So there's kind of a lot of things that have to break right in order for Christian Kirk to have a big opening, a big opportunity in this offense. But I do think if you can figure out a way to make all those things work out and line up for you, I think Christian Kirk has a huge opportunity to be the number 1 receiving option in that offense, especially if Kyler's available. I feel less confident about it if Colt McCoy plays. You may want to pivot elsewhere at that point, but even still, he's going to be the number 1 guy if Hopkins misses. So that's a name to look for. It's a difficult window, considering they're the latest game, along with Green Bay and Kansas City.
Yeah, it's definitely a risky strategy, but one that could pay off incredibly if all falls your way. So I think that's interesting. I'll lump both of these Bills receivers together. Cole Beasley at 5,400 and Emmanuel Sanders at 5,600. We talked about Emmanuel Sanders last week. He had 1 target and 0 catches, but I don't buy it at all. The Bills are facing the Jaguars. This is just like an incredibly heavy passing offense against an extremely weak defense. And this is just really cheap for these two players, where Cole Beasley had 10 receptions for 110 yards last week. We won't talk about Sanders last week, but he's been kind of a touchdown monster, leading both.
Well, I think Sanders was on like a Veterans Day off, right?
Maybe, yeah. He just knew that they didn't need him that game, so he just decided to take the day off without letting anyone else know.
It does show he got targeted 4 times, so maybe Allen was confused and was throwing at him at the bench.
Yeah, that could have happened. I guess 4 targets, but still 0 receptions.
Yeah. Tough day at the office. I expect him to bounce back. And the other part of this is that you may expect, if Buffalo is dominating the Jaguars, which likely will happen, they don't tend to rely on their running backs too much, even in those blowout wins. So I do expect Josh Allen and the Bills to continue passing the ball, kind of just like that meme where, and maybe you can include it in the video portion if you want to, but there's a meme from The Simpsons where this kid in the crowd is like, stop, he's already dead.
Yes.
I don't know if you've seen that, but
I have.
That reminds me of how Buffalo treats their opponents with their passing usage.
Yeah, and I think that's great for fantasy. So yeah, keep an eye on those two. Next player we'll talk about, maybe just briefly, Brandin Cooks. Kind of for all the same reasons we talked about Tyrod Taylor, and he could be a decent stack if you go that route. Brandin Cooks is like the only fantasy relevant option on that team, mainly because he's the only option in that offense. So I think that he could be a decent play. 6,100, not the cheapest, but he has a good floor and has boomed before.
And you got to think, too, so Tyrod Taylor being back is obviously a benefit to him. Yes. It's better quarterback play, even though Davis Mills has kept Brandin Cooks pretty reliable still. But then you look at who's above Brandin Cooks at 6,100 and above. I mean, there's not many players there that you feel better about, I would argue. Mike Williams has been inconsistent. He's $1,000 more, for example, and he has a tough matchup this week. I mean, Devontae Adams is $8,200. He's going to have Jordan Love throwing the ball around. We don't know if that's going to be super reliable. Yeah. So I really, at that price point and with his ceiling, I think that there's a pretty good opportunity for Brandin Cooks to have a good game in DFS.
Yeah, and we'll move on, and I'll throw out another stack option that I mentioned before. Amari Cooper at 5,700 and CeeDee Lamb at 7,200. I just think that for my personal lineup, I have Dak and those two as a stack. I just think that, they got it done with Cooper Rush, and now last week whenever Dak was injured, and now Dak's just going to be even better. And I think Amari Cooper, if you just go for one of these guys, I think Amari Cooper has incredible value at 5,700. And then, Lamb has proven himself, and I don't mind spending 7,200 on him either. So I think that's a very strong duo. And we've already talked about the Broncos offense. We keep on harassing my favorite team, but I just think that it's going to be a really good day for that offense in general. And originally, because of the reasons we talked about Kirk Cousins, I had a stack when I was making a lineup at first with Cousins, Thielen, and Jefferson, but I way prefer Dak, Cooper, and Lamb for cheaper across those 3 players. So, but that's another option, but that's just how I feel.
Yeah, cheaper combined, not cheaper at each position.
Yeah, across all of them.
Yeah, and then the last one that I'll quickly mention, and we didn't talk about this in pre-show, but I do want to mention Marquise Brown. I think that, if he hadn't had some of those drops earlier in the season, he could have a few extra touchdowns on his resume so far. He already has 6. And in the last 3 games, he's averaging just over 9 targets, I want to say. Let's see, 19 plus 10. Yeah, just over 9, right below 10 targets per game. And with Minnesota being there, we saw how Cooper Rush did. It's a good matchup. I like Lamar Jackson to find Marquise Brown for at least one touchdown. That's just going to be my bold prediction, we'll say, for this week.
Yeah, I like it. We can move on to the tight ends. This is someone that is extremely cheap, so that would be a cheap option, but should have a good floor because of Noah Fant's absence because he tested positive for COVID, and will for sure be out this Sunday. We talked about him in the Fantasy News episode. Albert, and I'll try my best, Okwuegbunam, tight end for the Broncos for 2,600.
Albert O. Yeah.
Albert O. I just think that the Cowboys are much easier to pass against, and Albert, as I'll just call him, he's had a games. I don't think he actually played weeks 5 through 7. Might have been injured, but every other game he's had a small handful of targets, and now the door is open for him with Fant being gone, and he's priced, with Fant being there, so he's very cheap for what he should perform at. So I think that is a decent option if you're wanting to go cheap at this position.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, a similar player as far as just a cheap option would be Tyler Conklin for the Vikings at 3,000. And we talked about him in Week 9 matchup previews video. I don't think he played in Week 7, but other than that, I mean, he's had games.
That was their
even
bye
more.
week.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there you go. Definitely didn't play that week. He's had even more receptions, and he's just been sneaky good. Like, he's had a game with 7 receptions, 70 yards, and a touchdown, and he was priced 2,900 that week. Like, his price has not been raised.
Yeah, the thing about Conklin, I mean, he's got at least 4 targets in all but one game, and if he falls in the end zone with the amount of volume that he's seeing, he's going to pay off for you at 3K.
Yeah, I agree. We'll move on to, I'll let you talk about him, Dan Arnold at 3,400.
Yeah, so like we talked about, obviously it's a rough matchup for the Jaguars, but what we saw Dan Arnold do in last week's game against the Seahawks, where they also got blown out, he had 10 targets, 8 catches, 68 yards. So clearly Trevor Lawrence likes him. They traded for him earlier this season. So I think that Dan Arnold at his price, obviously Jacksonville is going to have to keep passing the ball in order to try to play catch up with the Bills. I think that at his price, I may like him a little bit better than Conklin just because he has a higher ceiling in terms of targets. But obviously fewer touchdowns, it's a risk at that price, but we're just, we're working with what they're giving us.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's another good pick. We can move on from there. Someone I'm not completely excited about, but Dallas Goedert, 4,500 against the Chargers. This is the cheapest price he's been all season, even when Ertz was still there. 4,500. And last week he had 6 receptions for 72 yards. So I think he has a really good floor. If he finds the end zone, he could boom. I'm just not too excited about trusting this offense. But he is cheaper, and I don't think he's a horrible pick.
Yeah, the crazy part is that we're talking about not trusting him in this offense when they scored 44 points last week.
Yeah. But
it was just all through the running backs, unfortunately.
Yeah. Who we also do not trust, as we did not mention them, because who knows, out of those 3 that are playing, who will do the best. We'll move on to Mike Gesicki at 4,900, and I guess I'll let you talk more about him. We've talked about this Texans-Dolphins game a lot, but so it kind of goes without saying.
Yeah, I mean, well, because there is going to be a lot of opportunity for points in this game, I think Gesicki might go Gesicko mode. He's been targeted very heavily in the games where Will Fuller and Devontae Parker have been absent. That is the case this week. So from that perspective, I like his ceiling too. He's a 20-plus point scorer when he's not even necessarily having to score in that game. He's got a game with 8 catches and 115 yards that allowed him to get just above 20 with 22.5, and that's from the 3-point bonus of a 100-plus receiving game. So keep in mind that these players that are high in yardage can technically do better than a player who gets a few more catches.
Yeah, and I'll let you wrap up tight ends by letting you talk about Darren Waller at 6,200.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not sensing a theme, I think the games of the week that we're picking right now are
Oh yeah.
the Raiders Giants and the Texans Dolphins. I do expect, in the absence of one of their pass catchers, that the Raiders are going to focus on Darren Waller more, like we talked about with Hunter Renfrow. And so we obviously know Darren Waller's talent. I think that he is going to be a pretty good option at 6,200. Now that is 800 below Travis Kelce, and you can argue that he hasn't been much worse than Kelce. So I like that play at 6,200.
Agreed. We'll wrap up the episode. We'll talking about a few defenses. I think we're getting a feel for this week that there's a few defenses worth spending up on. I'll let you start, I guess, with the Cowboys against the Broncos at 3,300.
Yeah, so I think since Washington is on bye, I can't pull up their stats right now, but we were seeing, I mean, the Broncos had multiple fumbles, not lost, but fumbles. They had multiple interceptions. Obviously, Dallas is expected to be leading this game, which does mean that likely Denver will have plenty of opportunities on offense, but that's more opportunities for a weaker offense without Noah Fant to, struggle to move the ball. And the other part of it is that they're a pretty good run defense. So I think that they can probably contain those Denver backs, and I think it's a good option at 3,300.
Yeah. And then we'll move on to the Saints against the Falcons in New Orleans at 3,700. I think this one's even easier to explain. The Falcons offense has just been... The Falcons team overall has just been abysmal, and they lost Ridley, their best option. So, and the Saints defense has been very strong. I mean, it was a pretty high-scoring game against Tampa Bay last week, but... before that, they're holding teams to, they're not letting teams blow up on them. They're allowing some points, but this is a Falcons team that does not scare you at all. So I think the Saints at 3,700 are a great pick.
Saints playing at home as well, along with the Cowboys.
And then this one's even easier to explain, and the last one we'll talk about. Bills defense at the Jaguars for 4,000. And it's just like this Bills defense is incredible. And you're facing an offense that is struggling really hard. Like this Bills defense is always pretty expensive just because they're really, really good. And now they have an extremely good matchup. So I think they're worth spending up for as well.
Yeah, and especially if you're going cheaper at the quarterback position or... some of the running backs that we mentioned, or even tight end, you can afford to spend up at defense, and that's usually a valuable strategy.
Agreed. So I think that wraps it all up. Guess we'll just end with that.
Yeah, thank you guys for listening. I hope you do well in your DFS matchups if you choose to play, and enjoy the Sunday games and the Monday game following that. So thanks for listening. See ya.